Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. I'm a little cold, but I wanted to talk about how WoW has been getting so bloated and how I'm honestly kind of worried that the war within is continuing on with that trend. One of the biggest things that we saw with Oracle Priest just last week was how the spec is having to juggle between buffs to be able to deliver the proper buffs onto the players when you need them, and it adds another element of like cognitive load to be able to play the spec, and it's really not the only one that's happening alongside of it. And there's been a lot of discussion throughout the community, and I wanted to kind of go over a couple of clips from what other creators have been saying about how WoW has just gotten very bloated over the years.
The skill ceiling of World of Warcraft used to be pretty low compared to other games. To do the most amount of damage with any given class is not rocket science, right? But the more they add of these kind of support classes, the higher the skill ceiling is when you combine it with like a raid group. Because nowadays it's actually incredibly hard to fully, to get the full amount of damage you can gain from a full raid group is actually really hard.
And we also saw it with M+ when Augavoker was really coming into it, but it's also that WoW is so built on like a variety of modifiers and like multiplicative buffs on top of each other, where you were having the world first race with like Aug officers, where they would specifically sit down outside of the raid group just looking at logs the entire time to like min-max their damage. You would have obviously the PI combos with like Aug buffs that we had in like season 2, which has been obviously toned down a lot, but it's also just added to this bloat to the game where both like add-ons and the support specs have kind of like combined to add this like really large barrier of entry to be able to even play the game. And Asvin was also talking about this recently, where there's a couple clips I want to show talking about how, yeah, WoW is like really sweaty, and it's gotten sweatier and sweatier over the years as they've made things harder. But add-ons, and I would honestly say most of it comes to the complexity of the specs in the game, which almost like requires the add-ons to be able to properly leverage. That has also added this element to the equation, which is increasingly just not friendly to new players.
Do you guys think these are going to be cool, these hero specs? Because like, I think they could be cool, but my concern is that I think that if Blizzard tries to make them cool, it won't be balanced. And retail WoW is for a bunch of like try-hard nerds. Like, that's what retail WoW is all about.
Okay, so speaking as one of the like try-hard nerds, I see what he's saying, but like also a little bit later in the video, he also talks about how like you don't want to invite anybody who's gonna like make your life harder. It's like, yeah, you do want to min-max, but like what else is there for like endgame, you know? You want to make sure you're pushing the hardest progression possible, or pushing with your friends and accomplishing the dungeon, and then it's not fun when someone kind of ruins the experience, even if it's an honest mistake or they just didn't have the experience. Like, yeah, if you don't complete the dungeon in time, it's not that fun. And
allowing some people to put in partial effort and other people not to put in partial effort, well, then you create a reward structure around putting in partial effort, and the people that are putting in full effort leave. So that's what happens.
Like every raid guild ever.
You discriminate on rats? I discriminate on anybody that doesn't put in, like, if you're not enchanting your gear, if you're not performing well. If I know you, obviously I'm going to give you special treatment because that's just the way it is. But otherwise, no, I absolutely discriminate. Like, if somebody is not like fully ready, or they're not like enchanted, or I don't feel like they're prepared, then yeah, fuck them.
So it really boils down to like, everyone is going to end up being sweatier in these games, whether it's going to be like people doing the Season of Discovery like pre-leveling tactics, which I think got nerfed, or whether it's retail players mapping out and you're using add-ons to figure out the best leveling route, or people figuring out the best way to farm seeds and Emir Drasil so they can get their infinite augment rune, so they can always have an augment rune, and that's their like min-max grind. Like, I don't know, there's always going to be this sweatiness in World of Warcraft. There's always gonna be sweatiness in like pretty much every game you ever play these days. I think that was actually kind of the problem I had with New World, was that I felt like super behind when I was trying to do like a new player experience when I first started playing that in like beta. Was like everybody already had it figured out, and I felt like I was behind. But WoW also has the additional problem that, yeah, people are inevitably going to be sweaty, but when there's so much bloat to the game, when I would argue that Dragonflight talents contributed more to bloat. I think as in one of the clips that we have, he kind of talks about it, how they've scaled it back because they didn't have covenants, but I actually think they kind of made it worse in Dragonflight, especially for healers, because there was so much power creep. And I really think that the hero talents, Oracle in particular, are adding on to this power creep in a really big way that ups the amount of complexity. And even some of the like net neutral or slightly positive reviews that we've seen for some of the hero talents from other classes or specs, it still adds another element of like bloat that comes into the equation as well.
To me, like, I feel like I can't get into the game because there's so many things that are in the game. Like, there's just so much to it. And I've never really, I don't feel that way with Lost Ark. I don't feel that way with Final Fantasy. I don't feel that way with New World. But, like, WoW just has, like, all of these extra, like, verticals of difficulty that, like, no other game has.
A shadow pine,
and just not even difficulty, like complexity.
And I think this complexity that he starts talking about, and we'll have another clip as well, really comes down to when you're trying to stack all these modifiers together, like Nagura was talking about in her clip. It comes down to how you're balancing out each of these individual Dragonflight talents, which is somehow interacting with some of your larger cooldowns and stacking Shadowlands legendaries, Covenant abilities, old legendaries, even some like essence effects, all of these things sort of stacking together for like a new player experience. And so you don't want to just like have the game be dumbed down in its entirety, but every expansion adding something else onto the equation inevitably has this infinite sort of power creep to it. And that was actually some of the reason after MOP really that they started doing some like the class pruning, which obviously had a really like negative effect in the community where they were really tired of like losing buttons and really tired of like losing extra abilities. But now we're kind of beginning this cycle again where people are looking at having too many keybinds. And one of the biggest things when it comes to a new expansion is they always want to bring something new to the equation. They always want to add something new to the equation. And I understand that. And it makes sense when you're trying to sell new expansions that you want some reason for people to come back. But then it always seems to boil down to another way that classes get like more deeply complex. Now, Final Fantasy, on the other hand, I haven't played it like super crazy in depth for multiple expansions the way I have with WoW, but I was playing it for Shadowbringers into Endwalker, and one of the things I really liked about it was that there were some slight reworks to how the spec was. When I was playing a lot of Astrologian, and then obviously I played a little bit of Sage, a little bit of White Mage, but there weren't these like full additional abilities or full like fledged massive amounts of bloat. Like I think going into Endwalker, we got like a new raid cooldown or something like that, but it was like one extra keybind maybe that was getting added into the equation. And then they were simplifying how you were like drawing cards and cycling cards or something along those lines. And as a result, they weren't just adding lots of new things on top of each other that you had to be able to juggle around, but it was more so like cleaning things up. And one of the ways a lot of people in the community were really hoping that a lot of these hero talents would actually go would be that they'd be more along the side of cosmetics for class skins. Kind of the way that people were hoping that Shadowlands Covenants were going to be more cosmetic and less about a variety of different ways of building up power.
Blizzard doesn't understand after the failures of the past of player power connected systems, it's constant half measures instead of giving players what they're asking for.
Because if you were having things that were going to be more cosmetic or they were going to be more about your choice or like how things are going to be appearing and they're going to be appearing really cool, but it's not going to add some like extra level of complexity to the equation, then you're able to look a little bit cooler without having to go through, you know, Oracle Priest, which is having all these additional add-ons on hand to be able to track the buffs, or weak auras to be able to track which buff that you're cycling between and deliver it to the right target. Or in the case of the Keeper of the Grove setup, you're having to adjust your spellcasting sequence as a Resto Druid to be able to properly balance out a number of buffs that you have on hand that you previously did not have to worry about before. And then it was just coming down to cosmetics. Because when it's always coming down to this player power equation, it's always going to add another layer of complexity on hand to be able to deal with the content. And keep in mind that the content's also getting harder, and historically has been getting harder over time. I think Sepulchre was obviously a huge step up that we had in difficulty. They kind of brought it back down for Vault of the Incarnates. It got a bit harder in Aberrus. And then, of course, it capped off with the equation here in Emirgasil, where that is sort of the natural sort of life expectancy that you're going to see for a lot of expansions, where, yeah, you're going to have each raid tier sort of step up in difficulty, and then it kind of resets a little bit, and then it keeps going up and up and up. But one of the biggest things is that the trend always ends up going higher over time. And that's where having the content getting more difficult over time and then classes getting more difficult over time makes it a lot more difficult to bring new people into the equation. Now, Asmon in this video said a lot about like making sure you just get rid of add-ons in its entirety. I don't really agree with that, but there certainly is a lot of bloat that I do agree with that happens in the class trees, that happens in the spec trees as they get more bloated. And I really think that a lot of these hero talents are just adding on to the bloat. And eventually, I think what's actually going to happen with these hero talents, if not in beta, then certainly over the course of the War Within's life, is they're probably going to get less and less important to operating your spec and become more and more about the flavor and more about the cosmetics, which is something that players are early on really calling for. Just like players were very early on calling for Shadowlands Covenants to be swappable all the time. It feels like we're kind of repeating that cycle once more.
Yeah, I think that people are right to complain about it, but I think that the real problem with WoW is like just on a fundamental level, the way that the game is designed. Like the game is designed in a way that is built completely around optimization and min-maxing. And that's happened because you have 15 years of optimization and min-maxing. And like in classic WoW, it's not as bad. It's still there, but it's not as pronounced. It's not as important.
That's the thing is, I think it is still going to be very pronounced regardless of what happens, but Blizzard, of course, has the option of how they want to set aside like their baseline, because the more that you add into the equation to min-max, the more that you're going to have this like vast gap between players. The more that you're going to have players who are going to be separated by having add-ons and being able to interpret the add-ons appropriately. Players that do have add-ons and are having like a bad UI setup or a lot of like issues of like tracking too many buffs or tracking the wrong things. And then over here, you're having players who are brand new to the game have to learn how to experience the content itself, the raids, the dungeons, the PvP, what the heck crowd control is and DRs are, right? They have to experience all of that without being able to interpret the information because there's 50 million different add-ons that you have, and trying to get somebody in a new player in 2024 from this part to all the way over here feels like it's gotten wider and wider and wider than ever. But of course, everybody does want to be sweaty. Everybody does want to make sure they complete the content. Asmongold, like we mentioned, said that himself. So where is it that Blizzard's actually going to be able to do something productive? I don't think it's getting rid of add-ons in its entirety, but I do think that the more that they add on lots and lots of class-specific buffs, the more it's pushing players and it's pushing this gap between players to be wider than it is ordinarily. One of the good things about borrowed power systems in the past was that eventually you got rid of them and they were replaced by something new. While there were tons of problems with the acquisition, I think the general idea of like, here you have this power, okay, it doesn't actually carry forward into the next expansion with you, here's a new power to replace it, so you're not just like constantly perma-bloated all the time, actually isn't bad. It's just the acquisition of like getting that for your main, getting that for your alts, just burn people out. And I don't think that acquisition's necessarily gotten better with like the extra upgrade system that we have on hand, because it's still a pain in the ass to gear alts, but maybe that's a video for another time. At the moment, I am really of the opinion that the hero talents are not really heading in the direction I think the community wants and the community needs to be able to actually welcome in new players into a new expansion, adapt them and sort of onboard them into like how the game works, have them experience it and like wanting to get better and like wanting to improve so that they can do their dungeons or do their raids with friends. And I think that Blizzard's doing a really massive disservice to themselves because it just gets that much harder to get new blood in to the mix. Let me know what you guys think, if you agree or disagree, and maybe I'll have to have a whole video dedicated to borrowed power and how I think it actually is a good theoretical system. It was just badly executed because of how acquisition worked. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch y'all next time.